Hello and welcome. You've found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today we're going to be talking with Kaya Connor about stigma. Kaya is a doctoral candidate at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work and a master's student in the School of Public Health. She's a Hartford Doctoral Fellow and a CSWE Minority Research Fellow. Kaya is also a licensed social worker who maintains a part-time private practice. Her doctoral dissertation is called Mental Health Treatment Seeking Among Older Adults with Depression, the Impact of Stigma and Race. In today's interview, Kaya defines stigma and discusses implications for research, direct practice, and public health. First question, Kaya, what is stigma?
Well, you know, Jonathan, it's really difficult to give a clear and succinct definition of stigma because there are a lot of different components that come together to make up stigma. So in research on stigma, we tend to talk about stigma as containing a component of stereotyping, the component of prejudice, and the component of discrimination. So, for example, if you have an individual who, let's say, has a mental illness, as a researcher, I'm looking for them to be talking about specific experiences of being stereotyped based upon having that mental illness. I'm looking for them to talk about experiencing prejudice based upon that mental illness and actual experiences of being discriminated against based upon having that mental illness. So as you can see, there's a lot of different components that go into the overall experience of stigma. And really, stigma is a powerful phenomenon that's linked to these different values that we place in society on social identities. And stigma can be talked about as any kind of mark or characteristic that devalues the person that bears that mark. So when we talk about stigma, we're really looking for two requirements. And the first requirement is an actual recognition of a difference based upon this mark or characteristic. So in the prior example we gave about mental illness, we're actually needing to recognize that mental illness, whether it be visibly being able to see it, hearing it, or actually being told by someone that that person has a mental illness. So we have to recognize the difference. And then the second requirement is the subsequent devaluation or stigmatization of that person, which is actually the behavioral response that that individual may get from people in society or from themselves. And Erving Goffman, who is actually one of the stigma gurus, he defines stigma as any mark or sign that designates the bearer as spoiled or therefore valued less than quote-unquote normal people.
So spoiled, not in the sense of, boy, that child is so spoiled, but more like milk.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the stigmatized individual possesses or is believed to possess some kind of attribute or some characteristic that is devalued in a particular social context. And what's interesting about stigma is that it is a social construct, which means that it's different based upon different cultures, and it also is different based upon different periods of time. So, for example, if we take aging, in American society, there tends to be a stigma about aging. You know, we don't want to grow old. People on the media, once they're a certain age, they're no longer able to get the same roles in Hollywood. I mean, we see all these images about aging and the stigma about aging. But in other cultures, the older adults are the most wise people. They're the most valued members of society. So we can see that the stigma of aging really may be relevant for our Western European culture, but maybe not so much for other cultures. And if you also can think about the time factor, 10, 15 years ago, a disease like cancer was stigmatizing in our society. We didn't know about cancer. We didn't know about how to treat cancer. So people who had cancer were often stigmatized. Well, now we know a lot more about cancer. We know how to treat cancer. We know what causes cancer. So people with cancer tend not to be stigmatized as much in society now as they did 10 or 15 years ago. And things that are stigmas now may not be stigmas 10 or 15 years down the line.
So with this example of cancer, somebody who has cancer now wouldn't necessarily be seen as spoiled,
right,
or somehow less than.
Exactly.
They're simply somebody who has cancer.
Exactly.
Okay. Very interesting. So are there different types of stigma?
Yeah, we can actually talk about 3 different types of stigma and 2 differences in the ways people experience stigma. So as I talked about Erving Goffman before, he developed 3 specific types of stigma. And he talked about stigma in terms of abominations of the body, blemishes of individual character, and tribal identities. So some examples of abominations of the body would be things like physical deformities, facial disfigurement, and also excessive tattooing and piercing, which may be things that we are likely to see in current time. Blemishes of individual character would be things like mental illness, addictions, convicted felonies, and even homosexuality, which is a controversial topic. And lastly, tribal identities, things that you are born with, things that you're considered to have no control over. So, for instance, race, ethnicity, your sex, and maybe even religion. So Goffman talks about these three different types of stigma, and what we find is that the blemishes of individual character, those tend to be the stigmas in our society that are the most devalued, because it tends to elicit this idea that you had control over that. You're responsible for that. Even the wording blemish of individual character has a much more negative connotation to it in general. And we can also talk about differences in the way we experience stigma. And this actually came to us from Patrick Corrigan, who's a social psychologist and is one of the leading stigma researchers. And he talks about the difference between public stigma and internalized stigma. So if I again go with the example of someone with a mental illness, in terms of public stigma, I'd be wondering about how other people are going to see me because I have a mental illness, how other people are going to treat me. Are they going to stereotype me? Are they going to have a negative attitude towards me? Are they going to discriminate against me because I have a mental illness? But internalized stigma really looks at how I then feel about myself, the internal shame or the guilt that I feel about myself because I have a mental illness. I shouldn't have this. I should be able to pull myself out of this. I should be able to get on with my life, and I can't. And that affects how I feel about myself and impacts my self-esteem. And that's where we really begin to talk about stigma and how it can then impact other things like attitudes about getting help and seeking mental health treatment.
What does stigma look like?
Well, as I've talked about, there are a lot of different kinds of stigmas in today's society. There's a stigma of aging, I've talked about, the stigma of mental illness. There's also the stigma of race, the stigma of having drug addiction, the stigma of weight is a big deal in society right now, the stigma of homosexuality. So there are a lot of different kinds of stigmas. But some researchers have begun to develop 6 characteristics of stigma that help us to understand how severe a stigma is likely to become in society, or how much devaluation is placed on an individual. And the first characteristic is concealability, or in other words, visibility. So how visible is a stigma? Can you conceal it? If you were to see someone, would you automatically know? So we use the example of race. In our society, race, ethnicity, it is still stigmatized. African Americans in our country still tend to experience stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination simply based upon their skin color. And it's a very visible stigma for the most part. If you see someone, you know that they're an African American. It's not something that they can hide. Whereas other stigmas, maybe even mild mental illness, if someone has depression or anxiety, you might not be able to look at them and tell right away that they have a mental illness. So there's a difference in the ability to conceal a stigma. There's also differences in the course of the mark. So if you take a stigma like having AIDS, there tends to be more stigma placed on someone with AIDS than someone who may just be HIV positive. So it's the same illness. It's just a different progression of the illness, different course of how serious that illness or that stigma has become for that individual.
And that would be because the person with AIDS has more visible markers of being ill than, say, somebody who is HIV positive and perhaps asymptomatic because of medication.
Right. And I think it also has to do with this idea that there are some people in our society right now that have been HIV positive for 20 years and haven't gone on to AIDS, but I think that there's a hopelessness associated with having AIDS. You have AIDS, so you're going to die. And there tends to be some stigma associated with that concept. I think that's another issue as well, which could go on to the next characteristic, which is disruptiveness. How disruptive is this in the person's life? With someone with HIV, they may be taking their medications. They may not have as many symptoms like you talked about. They may not have the visible marks. Someone with AIDS may be in the hospital a lot. They're going through a lot of serious ailments and illnesses that are very disruptive in that person's life, and that can tend to impact how people stigmatize other individuals. The other big deal is controllability. Is this a controllable illness? Is this a controllable stigma? Or is it partly your fault for having this stigma. And I think that's where we get into a lot of the stigma about mental illness. There seems to be a myth out there that you should be able to control your mental health, that if you have depression, you should just be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get on with life, that there's no need for you to be depressed. People don't understand that it is a physical medical condition that oftentimes requires serious treatment, medication, therapy, and people don't always understand that, and therefore we see a lot of internalized stigma with mental illness, people blaming themselves and having guilt because of that mental illness. The other characteristic is aesthetics. You know, we are a visible society, we are superficial, and we like things that are pleasing to the eye. And oftentimes people who have stigmas that are visibly displeasing, that can become more stigmatized in our society. So things that look bad, we tend to stigmatize in our society. And then the last one is danger. Is the stigma dangerous? You know, am I going to be in fear of being around someone who has a particular stigma? Which is where we begin to look at the difference between a less serious mental illness and then severe and persistent mental illness. Oftentimes there is a myth that people with severe mental illness, say schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that they're dangerous. And research shows that that's not the case, but there is a fear. And people tend to stigmatize against people who they associate with danger or fear. So that's a way we can begin to look at some of the different characteristics of stigma, what they look like, and why certain things tend to be more or less stigmatizing in society.
So, Kaya, it sounds like the question, what does stigma look like, can be answered by saying what it looks like actually differs based on how visible it is. And in the literature, there are 6 characteristics that have been discussed that influence the extent to which it might be, the way that it looks externally and maybe the way it is perceived internally.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So given that, are there differences in who experiences stigma?
There are, and going back to the characteristics that you just talked about, visibility and controllability have been seen to be the key characteristics when talking about who experiences stigma. So people with more visible stigmas and people with more identified controllable stigmas, those are the people who tend to be stigmatized more often. So, for example, we can look at the difference between severe and persistent mental illness and less severe mental illness. We talked about this before. People with severe mental illness tend to be more stigmatized than those with less severe mental illness because it tends to be more visible. There tend to be symptoms or other factors that you can identify someone with more of a severe and persistent mental illness. And when you talk about controllability, we can talk about the differences between cancer and we talked about HIV and AIDS. We know that cancer is something that you don't have control over getting. We know that. So there tends to be less stigma placed on that. But things like HIV and AIDS, there tends to be a lot of stigma associated with that disease because there is the idea that you did something to contract that disease. You've done something to get that. So we can see that there are differences based upon how visible the stigma is and how controllable it is, and people with more visible and controllable stigmas tend to be stigmatized more in society. Interestingly, we also know that men tend to identify perceiving more public stigma, and women tend to talk about internalizing stigma more. And that may be due to women tending to kind of hold things inside. We also know that women are more likely to be depressed than men. So that's something that's interesting that some of my research in the future, I'm hoping to get more information about why that is. We also know that racial ethnic minorities are more likely to identify feeling stigmatized in society, which really has led to some of my research around multiple stigmas, or this idea that if you have more than one stigmatizing condition in society, how do those things then combine to create a unique stigmatizing experience for that individual and further impact them negatively and create a very much more persistent and salient stigma for that individual. So if you are, say, African American and you're stigmatized for being a racial minority, but you also have a mental health condition, and let's say you also are aging, so you have these multiple layers of stigma that can then interact and create a really powerful stigmatizing experience that can impact a number of outcomes for those individuals. So I'm hoping to get more information on that in my research as I go forward.
That's really interesting. So the idea of are there differences in who experiences stigma? It sounds like there are differences, and some of those differences have to do with gender,
right,
and race.
Yes.
And if you're a man, it might be more this external stigma that you were
Right.
talking about earlier.
Exactly.
For women, more of an internal. But there can be
Exactly.
multiple layers,
Right.
probably of internal and external, depending on what it is. It could be age, and older, race, African American, gender, female.
Right. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
There's a lot of different components that go into this idea of stigma. So it's great that we're doing this so that we can begin to get more information about stigma out there.
And so I would imagine that the with all these multiple levels and the complexity, this is one of the reasons why it would be so important for social workers to know about stigma.
Exactly. You know, social work as a profession is concerned with advocating for the needs of our most vulnerable populations and making sure that they are able to access the services that they need and that they're actually getting the most effective treatments that are available to them. And what we know from the research is that stigma is negatively impacting our most vulnerable populations. My own research has shown that stigma impacts people's attitudes about getting help. It impacts their attitudes and their intentions to talk with other people about what's going on in their lives, which is likely to impact their actual treatment-seeking behavior, specifically when talking about people with mental health concerns. And that's a huge issue that we as social workers need to be very concerned with. You know, I actually came into my research from my own practice experience in the field as a mental health practitioner working in the community. Stigma was a huge issue. It was very difficult to get people into the clinic to seek mental health services. And once we got them there, it was difficult to keep them there. And there were a number of barriers, transportation barriers, insurance barriers, financial barriers. But stigma was one of the most persistent barriers. It was really powerful, particularly for some of my older clients and some of my African American clients. And research has shown that African Americans tend to experience a lot of stigma, and that stigma is one of the most powerful barriers to them seeking mental health services. And stigma has actually been shown to predict early treatment discontinuation in older adults, which is really interesting. So that's why a lot of my research has focused on African Americans and the aging population, because stigma seems to really impact that group. So I want to be getting more information about why that is and getting that information out to social workers so that we as a profession can begin to combat that stigma and break down that barrier so that our most vulnerable populations are getting the help that they need.
So it sounds like you're saying that you can give people bus tokens.
Right.
Or you can send somebody to pick them up, or you can even schedule appointments when it fits in their schedule.
Right.
But that's not enough.
Exactly.
That there's this other concept, there's this idea of stigma that is in fact one of the most significant barriers to seeking treatment and also to continuing treatment once you've actually got your foot in the door.
Exactly.
So I got to be honest, it sounds like this is incredibly complicated. How would you research something like this?
Well, stigma research is fairly new, so it's important for us to get a large amount of information from larger groups of people, but it's also important for us to begin to get more in-depth information, oftentimes from smaller groups of people. So quantitative methods are really helpful for getting that kind of broad information from large groups of people so that we can really begin to understand the different elements of stigma. But then qualitative methodology is really great to go back in one-on-one and get some more in-depth information about stigma.
Before the interview, Kaya, you were telling me about a tool that you used in your quantitative research that was developed by Bruce Link that measures public stigma. What was that called?
The Perceived Evaluation and Discrimination Scale. And this scale really helps to get a standardized measure of public stigma as a concept. And Risher created an internalized stigma scale called the Internalized Stigma of Mental Illness Scale, which again helps to get a really standardized measure of internalized stigma. So in quantitative measures, we can do large-scale surveys and utilize these two scales, which both have excellent psychometric properties. I've used them both in my research, and they've been very effective to really begin to get more in-depth understanding of this idea of stigma and how it relates to specific outcomes, like attitudes about seeking treatment or actual engagement in different kinds of treatment. But then qualitative methods, focus groups, in-depth one-on-one interviews really help to get more in-depth understanding about the perceptions and the experiences of stigma from the perspective of the stigmatized individuals themselves. And that's really important for us as stigma researchers to really begin to understand the experience of stigma from people who are experiencing it on a daily basis. And I've tried to utilize both quantitative and qualitative methodology in my own research that I'd like to talk a little bit about now to give you an idea of some of the things that I've been doing. I'm currently a part of a large quantitative study that's being conducted out of the University Center on Social and Urban Research. It's a random digit dialing survey where we have surveyed 300 adults in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, half of them African American, the other half white, and 100 of that 300 are actually older adults. So we can begin to look at, younger adults and older adults. And we're looking at this idea of stigma and how that impacts attitudes about seeking mental health treatment, how that impacts their intentions on seeking treatment, and actual engagement in treatment-seeking behavior. So we're looking at stigma, but we're also looking at this concept of race and if there are differences by race on how people feel about mental health treatment and how their experiences are with stigma. So we've just gotten some of that data back. We're currently in the data analysis process of that study right now. So I'm really excited to see what we'll come up with from that study.
That is exciting. Now, when you say older adults, what do you mean? What is an older adult?
Well, in our study, and again, this varies from study to study, but we're looking at adults that are older adults being 65 and older.
Okay. All right.
So that's how we're qualifying older adults in our study.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Sure. Another study that I'm doing is actually a focus group study at Alma Illery Medical Center, which is a primary care center here in Pittsburgh, located in Homewood, serves predominantly African Americans. And we've been doing focus groups with older African Americans who are also depressed, trying to get some information about their own ideas about depression. What does it mean to them to be depressed? How have they experienced depression? And what have their barriers been to seeking mental health treatment? And stigma has been one of those barriers that has come up over and over and over again. So I'm really excited to get more in depth into that data and begin to produce some themes around stigma and their experiences with stigma. And I also am a part of a study looking at the multiple experiences of stigma in aging methadone maintenance clients. And this actual study recently is getting published in the Journal on Social Work Practice and Addictions. I just found out about that last week, so please be looking forward to seeing that come out in the next couple of years here. And that study really is a in-depth qualitative study where we did interviews with 24 older adult opiate addicts who were on methadone treatment who were also depressed. And that study really was a foundation for getting this information about the experience of multiple stigmas and what it means to be aging and be a drug addict and have a mental illness and be African American. All these things combined, which produce some really interesting results. So when that comes out in that journal, be sure to check it out.
Absolutely. I can't wait to check that out. And we'll put the link for that journal article when it comes out up on the website.
Oh, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Now, Kai, you've mentioned a couple of different variables. You've talked about addiction. Right. You've talked about gender.
Right.
But you've also talked about race. And I'm just wondering, can race be considered an independent variable?
Yes, it can, Jonathan. And this is actually kind of a controversial topic, but what we know is that race has been shown to independently affect many outcomes, even when controlling for all other variables. And in my own research, race was shown to independently predict negative attitudes about seeking mental health treatment, even when we controlled for age, education, and income, and all the other social economic factors that tend to be identified as being confounded with race. So even though I do believe that it's kind of unfortunate that a social construct like race can independently predict such negative outcomes, as long as this continues to be the reality in our society, it's important for us to continue to study race in this way so that we can really understand how it's impacting this vulnerable population.
So, Kai, it sounds like your research has found that race, in fact, can be considered an independent variable, and that your research has incorporated other research, measures that have been developed to measure stigma, and that you've been involved in a large-scale quantitative study, but also these qualitative studies that have yielded some in-depth information. And I'm thinking about the folks who are out there listening who are clinical
right.
social workers who are thinking, this is all well and good, but I'm not a researcher.
Right.
I actually work face to face. So I guess my question for you is, are there treatments that address issues of stigma?
Well, currently there are no treatments that address stigma specifically, but I am hoping to change that in the future. A large part of my research is really to gain enough background information to begin to create an intervention that's specifically designed to reduce stigma in the clinical setting. But in the meantime, I think that clinicians can target stigma reduction as a therapeutic goal in any kind of treatment intervention that they're utilizing, and also things like psychoeducation that help people to understand the true nature and the true cause of mental illness, help people to realize that it's not their fault, and it takes some of the blame away from them as an individual, which I think does reduce their internalized stigma by helping them to realize it's not their fault, that this is a medical condition that they had no control over. And if people continue to do that in the clinical setting, I think that that really will help to reduce people's internalized stigma.
Okay, so are there other things that can be done to reduce stigma?
Yes, and as I said, internalized stigma may be able to be addressed in the clinical setting, but public stigma is a much more difficult piece of stigma to combat. As a public health student as well as a social worker, I'm in the process of developing a health communication campaign around stigma of mental illness in the community. And sometimes some of the biggest issue that continues to exacerbate stigma is a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding, misinformation about different stigmas. So a large health communication campaign can provide this information to communities who may not be getting it. There are a lot more commercials right now addressing mental health problems and the drugs for mental health. So we'd like to think that public stigma is going down. But one of the unique things that came out of the focus groups that I'm doing at Alma Illery Medical Center with the older African Americans with depression is that they were saying, not one of the people in those commercials are black. Not one of the people in those commercials were old. I don't relate to those people. I don't see myself in those people. So I must not be depressed. Something else must be going on, but I'm not depressed. So they can't see themselves in those advertisements. They're not relating to them. So in the same way that we as clinicians are taught to tailor our services to meet the needs of our diverse clients, it's important to put positive messages out there about mental illness and more information out there about mental illness that's culturally relevant and that can be related to the people who need to get it. And that's the only way that we're going to really begin to reduce stigma in the community.
So it sounds like in terms of something that clinicians can do is they can address the internalized stigma.
Right.
But your public health campaign is addressing this issue of public stigma.
Right.
Which has as much, if not more, to do with people outside of the person who might be stigmatized than that person themselves, and that requires this public media campaign changing who's visible, what's visible. Okay.
Exactly, and both are equally important. So, as social workers, as public health practitioners, we all need to be together in this fight to eliminate stigma as a barrier for these individuals.
So I guess, final question, and this has just been a fascinating conversation, Kai, I've really enjoyed it, is to just pose this question to you. Some people might say that stigma research and this idea of stigma is just sort of the flavor of the month. There's discrimination, there was stereotype, people have been researching these things for a long time.
Right.
How would you address the criticism that stigma research is just the flavor of the month?
Right. And, I have heard that a lot. And, my response would be that stigma is becoming a really important research topic. And I think people are finally beginning to realize the salience of stigma and the difference between stigma and things like discrimination and prejudice, and how really those are all components under this broader concept of stigma. And people are beginning to recognize the persistence of stigma as a barrier to treatment. There's more research money available for stigma research. There are more scales being developed to measure stigma. And in my opinion, this is all a good thing. Even though we are doing more research around stigma, the fact of the matter is there are still huge gaps that persist in the stigma literature. We need to further address the issue of causality and being able to have stigma predict certain outcomes. We need more information about experiences of stigma from the perceptions of stigmatized individuals themselves. And we need to do a lot more research in this idea of multiple stigmas and how multiple stigmas interact to produce unique stigmatizing experiences and how multiple stigmas predict outcomes. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And additionally, much of the research on stigma continues to be done in psychology. So we need more social workers to do research on stigma and to find ways to apply the research to clinical practice, because that's really what I think is important. So there's still a lot of work to be done in this area, and my only hope is that my research will continue to add to this growing body of knowledge. And I want to acknowledge the efforts of the John A. Hartford Foundation, who continue to support my work on stigma and aging. And as I said, stigma is such an important area of research that is incredibly relevant to the social work profession. And the field of psychology has really been a driving force of stigma research. So I would like to acknowledge my research mentor, Dr. Charlotte Brown, who is a clinical psychologist and an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, for her encouragement and for helping me to bring this research into the field of social work. And I would also like to thank my dissertation chair, Dr. Nancy Grote, who is an associate professor of social work, for her continued support, encouragement, and her mentorship.
Well, Kaya, thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your insight into stigma. And I hope that for anybody out there listening to this podcast, whether you're a policy person, community organizer, or actually work face-to-face with clients in a therapy office, that this podcast is informative and interesting to you and hopefully helpful as you go out there and do the good work with folks, as it has been for me. So, Kaya, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
So, I'm Jonathan Singer. Thanks for being with me today for this episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode, visit our website at socialworkpodcast.com. If you have suggestions for future podcasts, please email me at jonathan@socialworkpodcast.com. And to all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you back here next time at the Social Work Podcast.